In order to keep our fighting forces on the offensive, moving ahead and attacking, they must be fed, and fed well. That's where you've got to prove your value to the Army. It will be your job to supply bread, and it must be good. Here's a section of a bakery company moving forward in the field. Its equipment is being transported on 2 trucks, so that if one gets knocked out, the remainder of the equipment can still be used to produce bread. Here's where a knowledge of map reading is important. The sergeant must check to be sure he is in the right area. Note the area has good cover in spite of being near roads that lead to the front. It's fairly level, well drained, and has a good supply of water, which has already been okayed by the medicos. Because the campsite might possibly be exposed to enemy view from the air, a camouflage net is stretched over the area. For protection, foxholes are dug and camouflaged. You'll save yourself a lot of lugging if you'll back your trucks into position where your equipment can be unloaded easily. This section consists of 9 men. The sergeant is the senior non-con. His job is to make sure that his men produce enough bread daily for at least 2,500 men. He can do this by dividing his section into 2 shifts. Make certain that the bottom part of the oven rests firmly on level ground. Each part of the oven is so designed that in an emergency it can be moved by 4 men. However, it's wise to use all your crew in making camp. Be especially careful, the sides of the 2 sections fit flush. Put your flue stacks in place. Tighten the connecting bolts. The ovens are now set to operate. After the ovens are set up, tents are erected. The storage tent has been pitched to house the baking ingredients and the finished bread. The other tent is used for mixing and makeup. Bread racks will be used to store and cool the hot, freshly baked loaves. The storage tent affords protection for our supplies against bad weather, and the underbrush protects them from the moisture of the ground. The baking equipment has now been laid out so that we get a smooth, straight flow of production from mixing to baking to storing to shipping. The molding table is set up. Small tools such as scales, a flour scoop, graduated measures, and dough scrapers are made handy. Platform scale is primarily used to weigh water and flour. In the meantime, several pails of water have been carried from the stream. Water must be at a proper temperature for baking. This M1937 fire unit is your heating element. Know how to operate and maintain it. Your entire baking operation is dependent upon its proper functioning. Each baking section has 4 insulated fermentation cans. they must be kept clean. The formula we are using will make 60 pounds of bread. It calls for 8 ounces of dehydrated yeast, which should be suspended in 4 pounds of properly tempered water for 45 minutes. A proportionate amount of sugar is used to act as a food for this yeast. During the time yeast is in solution, it changes from an inactive to an active state. Handy things, these foxholes. Less blood, more bread. The master dough schedule is a production table or a guide for a continuous operation. This permits maximum efficiency, since we are beginning the manufacture of bread at 8:30, and X is placed next to the time indicated. Number 13 on the master dough schedule will now be our first dough. The Army uses enriched hard wheat flour, which makes excellent bread. Weigh out 42 pounds. Next, measure out 13 1/2 ounces of powdered skim milk. This increases the nutritive value of the bread, adds flavor, helps color, and improves its keeping qualities. Now sift the two together, thereby removing any foreign particles, aerating the flour, and distributing the dry milk. Weigh out 1 pound of salt. This will give flavor, control fermentation, and strengthen the cell structure of the dough. Now add 1 pound, 11 ounces of sugar, which will provide immediate food for the yeast, improve the flavor, and give the crust a golden brown color. Pour these two ingredients right into the mixer. Yeast works best in temperature from 78 to 82 degrees. Here's how to get a dough out at 80 degrees. Take the temperature in the tent. It's 10 degrees lower than ideal. Now take the temperature of the flour. It's 20 degrees lower than ideal. Notice the total ideal is 240 degrees. We can now determine what temperature the water should be by subtracting the actual temperature from the total ideal. But wait, we have another factor to consider. We must make an allowance for the friction caused by mixing. In this case, we estimate the friction to be 20 degrees. Therefore, we subtract 20 from 110. This leaves 90 degrees, which should be the temperature for our water. Thus, in order to have our dough at 80 degrees, we must heat our water to 90. In tempering the water, be accurate. It's important. Good bread, and that's what you want to make, can only be produced by exercising proper care. Now weigh out 18 pounds of water. Remember, we used 4 pounds of water to suspend the yeast, so altogether we're using 22 pounds of water. This mixer is very important. It saves hours of manual labor. It has 5 cups that must be oiled according to schedule, 2 in the front and 3 in the rear. It was designed to mix enough dough for 1 oven charge. Take good care of it. The motor generates power for the mixer. The gas tank holds 2 quarts of gasoline, enough for 2 or 3 hours of steady running. It starts like any outboard motor. Check the oil reservoir every 5 hours to make sure it is full. Change your oil every 25 hours of operation. If you don't want to be mixing by hand, you'd better see to it that the motor and mixer are regularly oiled. Add the water to the salt and sugar already in the mixing bowl and start the mixer. Let the mixer run until it dissolves the salt and sugar. Add the sifted flour and dry milk. Continue to mix. Add the yeast solution. We purposely waited until this time in order to make certain that the yeast would not come in direct contact with the salt. A strong salt solution might injure the yeast. Now to open this overseas container. It holds our final ingredient, shortening. You may be doing this before long, so remember the technique. It's simple and saves fingers. After weighing out 11 ounces, toss small pieces into the mixer. This distributes it evenly throughout the mass. We have held back the shortening until now to be sure that the flour has absorbed all the water. After 5 minutes, stop the machine and open the mixer. Scrape the walls and cut the dough loose from the agitator arms. This will give a better mix. Make sure your hand is never in the mixing bowl when the arm is turning. Otherwise, it might be unsuitable for use for some time. Start the mixer going again. The object of mixing is to get a uniform mixture of ingredients, to bring about the formation and development of gluten, to distribute the yeast uniformly, and finally to provide food for the yeast throughout the mass. Keep it going from 5 to 8 minutes longer, or until the dough feels smooth, elastic, and dry. This indicates a proper mix. When the mixing is finished, the dough is transferred to a lightly greased and properly tempered fermentation can. These cans are well insulated and, like a thermos bottle, should retain the original temperature. Take a little time and smooth out the surface. This helps the fermentation process and the development of the dough. Now take the temperature. If our work has been accurate, it should be 80 degrees. It is. Record the reading and the time it was mixed on dough sheet number 1. It is your log on the progress of the dough, and it should tie in with the master schedule. In order to show the fermentation process, we have speeded up rising action by camera magic. The dough rises to approximately 4 times its original size. Let's test the dough to determine whether it's ready for punching. If the dough tends to come back, it's too young and not ready to punch. If the dough acts like this, sinking quickly, it's on the old side. Bread made from it may result in loss of flavor, color, and texture. If the dough acts like this, sinks away slightly and wrinkles somewhat, it's just right for punching. This punching process accomplishes 4 things. The temperature of the dough is equalized, the yeast is brought in contact with new food and oxygen, excess gases are driven out, and the stretching quality of the gluten is improved. When the job of punching is finished, the dough should be allowed to rise again for about 45 minutes. During this second rise, it goes through the same chemical process. We're simply working toward its maximum development. Don't forget to enter the time of punching on the dough sheet. At the end of the fermentation period, dump the dough on the molding table. Scale out individual pieces weighing 2 pounds and 4 ounces. As there is a loss in weight of from 10 to 12% during proofing and baking, this loss must be taken into consideration when dividing the dough. Thus, about 4 ounces of dough will be lost, giving 2-pound loaves of bread. The next job is rounding the dough. Rounding consists of bringing the ends in toward the center and rounding into a ball. This process forces out the excess gases, ensuring an even grain in the bread. At the same time, a thin skin is formed around the dough which acts as a seal, retaining the moisture and causing expansion and development of the gluten. Notice that the main job of rounding is done with the heel of the hand and 4 fingers. The palm is used merely as a guide. The next step is called intermediate proofing. The rounded dough is placed in bake pans and allowed to rest for about 15 minutes or until it has loosened up enough to be molded or shaped into loaves. Covering the pans with a flour sack will prevent crusting and assist in retaining moisture. Now let's see how the dough is molded into loaves. It is first flattened out to expel gas pockets. Next, the bottom and top are folded in toward the center and pressed. Finally, roll and seal the dough from top to bottom. Make sure that all seams are closed and that there aren't any breaks or air pockets. Here's where accuracy in mixing procedure shows up. A dough mixed at the right temperature and fully developed will not be sticky in molding. The dough is flattened, the bottom and top are folded in towards the center and pressed. It is then rolled and sealed from top to bottom. An experienced baker needs very little dusting flour in performing this operation. This is one of the most important skills in making bread and can be acquired by constant practice. The loaves are placed in a lightly greased bake pan. The seams must face down so that they can't break open in baking. Because molding has compressed the dough, it must be permitted to rise again to the desired height for baking. To achieve this and to restore its lightness, the bake pans are moved into the proofing chamber. The flour sacks keep the dough from drying out and crusting on the surface. Here it should expand to about double its size or until it reaches about the top of the pan. In about 15 minutes, turn the pans around and shift from top to bottom. This prevents crusting the loaves in the top chamber, where the heat is more intense. Now the temperature of the oven should be about 425 degrees. After another 15 or 20 minutes have passed, remove the dough from the proofing chamber. To increase the elasticity of the dough and prevent wild breaks when the oven heat hits it, wash the tops with water. Now the loaves are ready for the oven. The 3 pans are placed in each chamber at the same time. This prevents excessive loss of heat. To ensure a more even bake, switch your pans around at the end of half an hour. The left and center pans are turned around and their positions exchanged. The pan on the right is simply turned around. When the pans are shifted in the oven, the temperature may drop to 360 degrees, but will soon rise to 375. This is a good baking temperature for the type of oven used. Thoroughly baked loaves require a good hour and 20 minutes of baking time. To be sure they are done, tap the bottom with your knuckles. If you get a hollow sound, you know the bread is okay. Here's bread that any baker would be proud of, and any soldier relish. The final step is cooling the loaves for 5 hours or more. This permits the excess moisture to escape, form a firm crust that will resist mold and rope, and prevents damage during transportation. Their day's operation completed, these men can be proud of the work they have accomplished, for they know their bread is good bread and that it will aid in furnishing the zip our fighting forces need to carry them on to victory. Fill that bread basket, soldier. There's more where this came from, and we'll keep it coming.